Welcome to the deep dive. Today, wow, we're really tackling a big one. We're going back to 1859 to unpack Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. It's just such a fundamentally important book.
It really is. And, this isn't just a history lesson. We're looking at the absolute bedrock of modern biology here. Our goal, really, is to pull out the core idea, those key mechanisms he described, and understand why this book just completely reshaped how we see life itself.
Okay, let's try and boil it down. Darwin spent, over 2 decades on this, and the core message is species aren't fixed. They're not immutable.
Exactly. They evolve. They change over vast amounts of time, and the engine driving that change is what he called natural selection. It sounds simple, but the implications were enormous.
Simple but world-changing, because before 1859, the dominant idea, certainly in the West, was that every species was designed individually.
Completely fixed, yeah, a static blueprint. Darwin just shattered that. He gave us this dynamic, constantly changing picture of nature, self-regulating even. Change became the norm, not the exception.
That must have caused an absolute storm. And, the fascinating detail is that despite how radical it was, the first edition, it sold out completely. On the very first day it came out in 1859.
It did. People were clearly ready, or at least incredibly curious, even if the idea was, disturbing to many.
They must have been.
But you have to remember, he didn't just dash this off. The reason it landed with such impact was the sheer thoroughness. 20-plus years of collecting evidence, refining the argument. He knew he'd face massive pushback, scientifically and socially.
Right. That persistence really says something about the evidence he must have felt he had.
Absolutely.
So let's get to that engine then. Natural selection. Can you break down simply what it's actually doing?
Okay, think of it like a filter. Basically, organisms are born with different traits, right? Mm-hmm. And so those traits just happen to make them a bit better suited to surviving in their specific environment. Maybe they can find food easier or avoid predators better. Well, those individuals are more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. And crucially, they pass those helpful traits on. It's simple, but over generations, over millennia, that's what shapes life.
Yeah, and to really grasp Darwin's argument, you need to look beyond just survival of the fittest, which can be a bit misleading sometimes. He laid out a logical sequence, like 5 key concepts that work together.
Okay, so it's a chain of reasoning. Walk us through it. How do these pieces build the case for evolution?
Right. So step 1 is foundational, variation in nature. Just look around. Individuals within any species, they're not identical clones. There's diversity. Think finch beaks, moth colors, anything. There has to be variation for selection to even work.
Got it. If everything's the same, there's nothing to select from. Makes sense.
Exactly. Then comes the reality check. The struggle for existence. Life's tough. Resources like food, water, space, mates, they're limited. So there's competition. More organisms are born than can possibly survive.
Okay, so variation exists and life is a struggle. The third concept, natural selection, must act on that interaction. Precisely. Natural selection is the outcome of that struggle acting on variation. Those individuals whose random variations give them some small advantage, maybe they're slightly faster or better camouflaged or more resistant to a disease, they're the ones more likely to survive and, crucially, reproduce.
So that's the core loop. Variation, struggle, selection, repeat.
That's the engine, yeah. Generation after generation.
So if that engine runs for long enough, like geological timescales, what does it produce?
Well, that brings us to the next 2 ideas, which really require you to think long-term. Number 4 is speciation. This is how new species actually emerge. Over huge stretches of time, those small accumulated changes can build up within isolated populations. Eventually, they become so different from their ancestral group, and maybe from other isolated groups, that they can no longer interbreed successfully. Boom! You have a new species.
It's like compound interest, biologically speaking. Small changes adding up to something massive over time. You don't see it day to day, but zoom out millions of years.
Exactly. And that leads to the 5th, and maybe the most profound concept, common descent. This is the idea that connects everything. All species, living and extinct, ultimately share common ancestors. It implies this vast, branching tree of life.
Wow, that's the big picture, all life connected.
And what made the book so convincing beyond the logic was the sheer mountain of evidence Darwin presented. He pulled from everywhere.
Right, it wasn't just abstract theorizing. What kind of evidence did he lean on most heavily? He needed to convince a very skeptical audience.
Oh yeah, he was brilliant at synthesis. He used geology and paleontology, the fossil record. It shows sequences of life forms changing over time. That was huge.
Okay, fossils showing change. What else?
He also pointed to artificial selection. Look at what human breeders did with pigeons or dogs or crops. If we could create such dramatic variety in just a few centuries, imagine what nature could do over millions of years.
That's a clever analogy. It makes the abstract concept tangible.
Very. And then there was comparative anatomy and embryology. This stuff is fascinating. Well, think about your arm. Now think about a bat's wing, a whale's flipper, a dog's front leg. The bone structure, the underlying pattern, is remarkably similar, even though they're used for totally different things.
Huh. Never really thought about that.
Darwin argued this underlying similarity, this homology, only really makes sense if humans, bats, whales, dogs, all inherited that basic limb structure from a common ancestor, and then natural selection modified it for different lifestyles. It's powerful evidence for common descent.
That is compelling. So the evidence was broad, varied, but wasn't there something significant missing? Something he couldn't quite explain about how traits were actually passed down?
Yes, that was the major hole, the how of inheritance. Darwin knew variation was essential, and that traits were inherited, but he didn't understand the mechanism. The prevailing idea back then was something called blending inheritance.
Blending, like mixing paint.
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
The idea was offspring were just an average blend of their parents' traits. But if that were true, any beneficial new variation would get diluted and essentially disappear within a few generations.
Ah, so it would wash out the very variation natural selection needs to work on.
Exactly. It was a real problem for his theory. He knew inheritance had to work differently, allowing traits to persist, but he couldn't prove how. Of course, around the same time, Gregor Mendel was doing his experiments with pea plants.
But Darwin didn't know about Mendel's work.
Nope. Mendel's work on genetics, showing that traits are passed down as discrete units, genes, wasn't widely known or understood until much later, around the turn of the 20th century.
So when genetics was rediscovered and eventually merged with Darwin's ideas,
It was the missing piece. Genetics provided the mechanism Darwin needed. It didn't overturn his theory, it massively strengthened it. It explained how variation is generated and maintained. DNA, genes. They validated and expanded everything Darwin proposed.
okay, so the scientific impact is undeniable. It literally founded modern biology. But the ripples went much, much further, didn't they? Philosophically, socially. Why did this idea cause such an uproar outside of science labs?
Well, think about it. It directly challenged the idea of human exceptionalism. The notion that humans were somehow separate from or above the rest of nature.
Right.
If natural selection shaped all life, including us, it meant humans are part of that same natural process. Products of evolution, not special creations placed outside its rules. That was deeply unsettling for many people's worldview.
And inevitably clashed with religious interpretations.
Massively.
Yeah.
Especially literal interpretations of creation stories in the Bible. It sparked decades, even centuries, of controversy that, frankly, still echoes today in some places.
Yet at the same time, it laid the groundwork for so much modern science.
Absolutely. Beyond biology and genetics, it was foundational for fields like anthropology, understanding human origins, paleontology, even psychology in some ways. It provided a framework, a historical context for life.
You know, looking back, scholars often comment not just on the ideas, but on Darwin's method. The book itself is apparently quite dense, but incredibly methodical.
Oh, definitely. It's not light reading, but it's a masterclass in structured argument. He meticulously piles up observation after observation, addresses potential objections. He knew he had to build an airtight case based on evidence to persuade the skeptics. And he largely succeeded. Hashtag outro.
So, pulling back from the 19th century, what are the big takeaways from this deep dive? The enduring lessons from Origin of Species that maybe apply even outside biology. One that strikes me is adaptability.
Adaptability is survival, whether it's a species or, a business or even just how we approach our own lives. Success often comes from adjusting to changing conditions, not rigidly sticking to the old ways when the environment shifts.
That feels very relevant today.
And also the power of small, cumulative changes. Evolution shows us that tiny, incremental improvements consistently applied over long periods can lead to enormous transformations. Don't underestimate those small steps.
Right, it's not always about giant leaps, and maybe a third lesson is just patience and rigor. Darwin spent those decades gathering evidence before publishing.
Yeah, that commitment to proof, to really doing the work before presenting a potentially world-changing idea. That's a powerful lesson in intellectual honesty and persistence.
Definitely.
And perhaps the deepest lesson, for me anyway, is that sense of interconnectedness. The theory reminds us that all life shares a common origin. Everything from the smallest microbe to the largest whale, including us. We're all part of one vast extended family tree. There's a real unity in that diversity.
That's a great way to put it. So maybe a final thought for you, the listener. Darwin showed how relentless evidence can eventually challenge even the most deeply entrenched traditions, the things people thought were immutable, unchanging. It makes you wonder, what deeply held truths or unchangeable aspects of our own world today, maybe in society, technology, or how we think, are currently being chipped away at by new evidence? What evolution is happening right now that we might not fully see yet?
It's a fascinating question.